It was early Wednesday morning on November 26, 2025, when Nigerians woke up to a silence that felt heavier than usual. No sirens, no national address, no briefings from Abuja, only rumors drifting through marketplaces and radio stations, rumors that the Nigerian government had just returned from Washington after a secretive mission that no one had dared to describe publicly. And yet something was wrong. People could feel it in their bones, the way elders feel a storm long before the clouds gather. While the government remained tight-lipped, an unexpected voice emerged not from Abuja, but from Fox News in the United States. A U.S. lawmaker who had met the Nigerian delegation just days earlier broke the silence and revealed something extraordinary: that America had given Nigeria conditions so severe, so unprecedented, that they could reshape the fate of the entire West African region. Why didn't Abuja say a word? Why did it take an American official, not the Nigerian president, not the national security advisor, to tell the world what had been signed behind closed doors? For 3 years, Nigerians have been told that the government would expose the sponsors of terrorism. For 3 years, no names were revealed. For 3 years, the killings escalated, villages fell, soldiers died, and families lived in fear. And now suddenly the truth was being forced into daylight by a foreign power. Washington was no longer asking. Washington was warning. This raises a haunting question, especially for Americans who have watched Africa's struggles and resilience for decades. What agreement did Nigeria accept, and why is the government so afraid for its own people to know if developments in Nigeria concern you? If you've been following Africa's shifting landscape, if the rise of young leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso makes you wonder what direction the continent is truly heading, stay with me. Because what was discussed in Washington may determine whether West Africa finds stability or slides into a crisis that no nation can afford to ignore. Please share this video if you believe truth should never be hidden from the people. When the Nigerian delegation boarded a plane to Washington earlier in November, the public was told it was a routine consultation. Nothing more. No details, no documents, no stated objectives. Yet every seasoned observer, every diplomat, every analyst, every ordinary citizen who has watched the slow unraveling of Nigeria's security landscape knew something far more serious was at stake. Nigeria is not a country that travels to the United States quietly, especially not in the middle of a national security emergency. Behind closed doors in Washington, the delegation met key figures, officials from the U.S. Department of Defense, senior members of Congress, and a representative who had been championing a controversial discussion surrounding Nigeria's growing instability. The meetings were discreet, intense, and unusually long. And when the delegation returned home, their silence spoke louder than any statement they could have made. Days later, the world finally learned what had transpired, not from Nigeria, but from that same U.S. representative who appeared on national television to disclose the truth. His words stunned anyone paying attention. America had issued 2 conditions to the Nigerian government, conditions so uncompromising that they bordered on an ultimatum. The first demand centered on a man most of the world had never heard of: Sunday Jackson, a middle-aged Nigerian who had been sentenced to death in a case that, according to multiple observers, felt more like political theater than justice. Jackson's crime, according to court records, was acting in self-defense during an attack. But many believed the ruling was designed to send a message: no civilian may challenge armed militants, regardless of the circumstances. An American missionary who knew Jackson personally had traveled across Nigeria and the United States pleading for his pardon. He warned leaders that the world was watching, and now the United States was echoing that warning. Washington viewed Jackson's imprisonment as a symbol of Nigeria's inability or unwillingness to confront terrorism honestly. The second condition was even more startling. The Nigerian government was given 60 days to disarm all major terrorist and bandit groups operating within its borders. 60 days. In a nation where militants hold territory larger than some U.S. states, where convoys are ambushed weekly, where school children are kidnapped by the dozens, American officials reportedly said, "We have our own plan, but we are giving you the opportunity to act first." To military analysts, this was a seismic revelation. It implied 2 things. The U.S. considers Nigeria incapable of securing its territory. The U.S. is prepared to intervene unilaterally if Nigeria fails. For a sovereign nation, few messages could carry heavier weight. Although not formally listed as a condition, Washington strongly urged Abuja to do what it has avoided for years: release the names of those funding terrorism inside Nigeria. The Attorney General once claimed to have compiled a list. That list was never made public. Not one name, not one financier. Why? Because the sponsors of terror do not live in caves. They live in cities. They hold office. They influence policy. They shake hands with presidents. If Nigeria were to publish those names, it would expose a truth the world already suspects, that the state itself may be entangled in the violence it claims to be fighting. When the delegation came back to Nigeria, there were no press briefings, no explanations, no documents released. But journalists captured a telling detail. The National Security Advisor carried a stack of signed papers pages. Nigeria has never seen agreements Nigerians were never told about. And now, with Washington's conditions public, a difficult question hangs in the air. Did Nigeria accept terms it knows it cannot meet? Because if it did, the countdown has already begun. The true breaking point in this unfolding drama was not the secrecy of the meetings, nor even the severity of the conditions themselves. It was the moment a U.S. official looked into the camera and declared plainly, calmly, without diplomatic sugarcoating, that if Nigeria failed to disarm its armed groups within 2 months, the United States would step in and do it with or without Abuja's cooperation. For many Nigerians, that statement struck like thunder. For the first time in decades, a global superpower was openly acknowledging what citizens had whispered for years, that the Nigerian state was losing control and the world was preparing for the consequences. In Abuja, officials pretended nothing had happened. No press conference, no reassurance, no transparency. But their silence became the loudest confession. When a nation refuses to address an ultimatum of this magnitude, the public begins asking questions the government cannot afford to answer. On radio call-in shows, elderly Nigerians trembled as they spoke. Parents wondered how many more schoolchildren would disappear before anything changed. Veterans questioned why soldiers continued dying, while those who financed their killers lived freely in the nation's capital. Anxiety rippled through every corner of society. Nigeria's people are not uninformed. They have seen terror groups evolve into armies. They have watched convoys ambushed, villages burned, and officers executed. They have buried children, siblings, neighbors. So when the U.S. claimed that Nigeria might be unable or unwilling to suppress these groups, many citizens simply nodded. It was already their lived reality. Then came the interview that ignited an even deeper wave of outrage. On a major television network, a respected lawyer and human rights advocate laid out what he called the real architecture of failure. His words were clinical measured, but devastating. Nigeria had lost the monopoly of violence, the defining feature of a functioning state. Security agencies, police, Air Force, Army, intelligence services possessed the legal framework and manpower to fight terrorism effectively, but lacked political direction. Terrorist financiers walked freely, often protected by the same institutions meant to dismantle them. The judicial system processed dissidents faster than terrorists, revealing a corruption of national priorities. He added something even more shocking. Terrorist groups were communicating openly on TikTok on encrypted channels, sometimes even through intermediaries connected to local authorities, without any serious retaliation from security agencies. To millions of viewers, this was confirmation of what they had suspected: the state was either compromised or deeply overwhelmed. When pressed about federal strategy, government representatives insisted that non-kinetic approaches such as negotiation, dialogue, and amnesty would yield better results than military force. But the lawyer's rebuttal cut through the rhetoric. How many IDP camps have received dialogue? How many victims have been offered reconciliation? Why is compassion reserved only for those who terrorize the country, not those who suffer because of it? The critique drew applause nationwide. It also exposed the deepest wound Nigerians felt: abandoned by their own leaders. An even darker revelation. A former governor shattered any remaining illusions when he alleged that certain state officials had paid large sums, up to 1 billion naira, to terrorist groups. The allegation was never denied. Instead, it lingered in the public consciousness, reinforcing the idea that terrorism had become a profitable enterprise for some within the political elite. Then came the story that pushed the nation past its emotional threshold: the brutal killing of a highly respected general whose phone was captured and used to mock the military. In African military culture, few acts carry greater symbolic humiliation. The morale of soldiers plummeted. Many began to ask why they were risking their lives for a government that seemed unwilling to confront the enemy head-on. With the 2-month deadline approaching, fear turned into a grim anticipation. Would Nigeria act? Could it act? Or would the United States decide that patience had run out? The answer is not yet clear. But one thing is undeniable. The ultimatum has forced the world to look directly at Nigeria's crisis and forced Nigerians to question whether their government is still capable of protecting them. As the implications of the U.S. ultimatum settled into public consciousness, Nigeria's civil landscape began to shift in ways impossible to ignore. For ordinary families, the crisis was not theoretical, it was physical, immediate, and deeply personal. In villages across the north, parents now lived with the fear that at any moment, men on motorcycles could roar into town and carry away their daughters. Farmers abandoned fertile land because walking to their fields meant gambling with their lives. Entire communities that once thrived on open markets and shared labor were reduced to ghost towns long before the ultimatum was ever spoken. Across Nigeria, millions now live in internal displacement camps, not because of a natural disaster, but because their own towns have become uninhabitable. Children grow up behind barbed wire learning arithmetic under tents while listening to distant gunfire. Mothers speak of sons who joined the military out of patriotism, but died because they lacked proper equipment, intelligence support, or political backing. And each week new faces appear in the camps, victims of yet another attack, another abduction, another village erased from the map. To these civilians, Washington's ultimatum did not feel like foreign interference. It felt like acknowledgement, finally, of the suffering they had been forced to endure while their leaders discussed non-kinetic strategies in air-conditioned rooms. Politically, the consequences were just as severe. The Nigerian state was already strained by years of unfulfilled promises, but the ultimatum exposed a deeper crack, the widening gap between government narrative and public reality. The president's inability to visit attack sites, the lack of transparency around the U.S. meetings, the failure to publish the list of terror sponsors, all of it fueled a perception that the government was detached from the suffering of the people. Even within Nigeria's ruling circles, unease began to grow. Security analysts questioned why intelligence agencies could track online critics within hours, but claimed helplessness in locating armed groups who filmed their crimes and posted them online. The public saw this contradiction and drew its own conclusions. The government chooses when to be powerful and when to be powerless. As trust eroded, Nigeria's political class found itself under unprecedented scrutiny. Newspapers began openly debating whether Nigeria met the criteria of a failing state. Members of the National Assembly argued about the lack of coherent strategy. Retired generals warned privately that morale within the armed forces was dangerously low. For the military, the crisis was existential. Soldiers had long complained that they were sent into battle without actionable intelligence, proper equipment, or political backing. The killing of a high-ranking general and the public humiliation that followed shattered remaining confidence. Veterans spoke openly about a dangerous possibility that if political leaders continue to ignore the scale of the threat, the military may lose its cohesion or even its willingness to fight. No country can survive without a military that believes in its mission. And right now, many Nigerian soldiers believe they are fighting alone. Nigeria's instability does not stop at its borders. Neighboring countries, especially Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, fear the spillover of militants seeking new territory. Within the AES alliance, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré have warned repeatedly that Nigeria's unchecked militancy threatens the entire region's stability. To them, Nigeria's failure is not just an internal problem, it is an open gate through which violence can spread across West Africa. And so while Abuja continues to project calm, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Civilian life is deteriorating. Political trust is cracking. Military morale is sinking. Regional anxiety is growing. The U.S. ultimatum did not create these problems, but it has accelerated the moment when Nigeria must face them. The countdown is not just about 2 months. It is about whether a nation of 230 million people can regain control of its future. From Washington's perspective, Nigeria is not simply another troubled nation, it is the anchor of West Africa, a demographic giant whose failure would alter global security calculations overnight. American officials understand something many outside observers overlook. When Nigeria trembles, an entire region shakes with it. And in a world already strained by wars, migration crises, and competing spheres of influence, the United States cannot afford to watch Africa's most populous country slide toward collapse. For decades, American policymakers have viewed Nigeria as indispensable. Its oil reserves, its geographic position, its markets, its military size, each of these elements makes Nigeria a strategic pillar. But what truly alarms Washington today is how quickly the internal deterioration has accelerated. The intelligence community has been tracking the rise of hyper-armed militant groups, the collapse of rural governance, and the spread of extremist ideology across borders. According to analysts, the United States is operating under a simple, unsettling assumption. If Nigeria cannot defend itself, the consequences will not remain inside Nigeria. This is why the ultimatum was framed not merely as pressure, but as preparation. America is signaling that it will not allow a vacuum to form in a region already contested by rival powers. The international landscape adds another layer of urgency. China has expanded its economic footprint. Russia has increased its military partnerships across the Sahel. Europe is struggling to contain migration waves shaped by conflicts in the region. Against this backdrop, the United States sees Nigeria as a frontline in maintaining stability, both for Africa and for its own strategic interests. Foreign policy experts in Washington worry that instability in Nigeria could create a chain reaction, a surge in extremist activity reaching coastal states. Disruptions in global energy supply, a humanitarian crisis pushing millions toward Europe and North Africa, a geopolitical vacuum that rivals like Russia or China might quickly fill. This is why the ultimatum was not framed as optional. To the United States, Nigeria's failure is a global risk multiplier. Interestingly, as Nigeria struggles, a contrasting narrative is gaining international attention. Observers in Washington, Brussels, and even Beijing have noted that some smaller nations, particularly Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré, are taking a radically different approach to security. They are consolidating state authority, dismantling networks of foreign interference, and redefining sovereignty in ways that challenge the traditional Western model. American analysts have begun asking a quiet but significant question: is West Africa entering a period in which smaller, more unified states may outperform larger but fragmented powers like Nigeria? If so, it would reshape U.S. engagement on the continent. Global institutions, UN agencies, humanitarian groups, security think tanks are bracing for several possible outcomes. The worst-case scenario is not merely a U.S. military intervention. It is the collapse of a state so large that no international coalition could stabilize it quickly. The world has seen the consequences of failed states in Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan. But Nigeria, with its population of over 230 million, would represent a crisis of an entirely different scale. Thus, the U.S. ultimatum is more than a strategic maneuver. It is a message to the world: Nigeria must act, because the world cannot absorb what comes if Nigeria falls. And for Americans watching from afar, especially those who care about Africa's future, another question arises. Is West Africa's stability now dependent on whether nations like Nigeria can learn from the assertiveness and sovereignty-focused leadership emerging in places like Burkina Faso? This is a question the world is only beginning to ask. In the end, when we step back from the political noise, from the televised interviews, from the back-and-forth press statements, one truth emerges with painful clarity: Nigeria is standing at a crossroads that few nations ever encounter. This is not simply a security problem, or a governance problem, or a diplomatic embarrassment. It is a turning point, one that will determine whether the country regains control of its destiny or watches it drift into the hands of outside forces. The U.S. ultimatum did not create this crisis. It exposed it. It forced the world to acknowledge what millions of Nigerians have lived through for years: a government overwhelmed, a military stretched thin, communities abandoned, and institutions too paralyzed or too compromised to respond. For many Nigerians, the fear is no longer about whether foreign intervention might come. It is about what will happen if nothing changes at all. And this is where the warning becomes larger than Nigeria itself. If Africa's most populous nation cannot secure its borders, protect its citizens, or confront the financiers of violence within its own political class, then the entire region will feel the shockwaves. West Africa is already carrying more than its share of instability. Another fracture could reshape the continent for a generation. This is why leaders across the Sahel, especially those embracing a sovereignty-first model like Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, are urging Africans to rethink what security truly means. To them, sovereignty is not a speech. It is the willingness to confront hard truths, expose corruption, and take responsibility for the safety of one's own people. Whether or not the world agrees with their methods, there is no denying that many Africans see in Traoré a kind of leadership they have long been searching for: decisive, unapologetic, and deeply rooted in national survival. So now the question falls to the viewers, especially those in America who have followed Africa's history through decades of triumphs and tragedies. Can Nigeria still turn this moment around? Can a nation this large reclaim its security without foreign intervention? Or will West Africa begin to look elsewhere to leaders who prioritize sovereignty above political convenience? Your perspective matters because the world is watching the same clock Nigeria is. And as the deadline approaches, every hour carries weight. If you believe that truth should never be hidden from the people, if you believe Africa deserves transparency, safety, and leadership grounded in integrity, then please share this message. And if you want to stay informed about the rising new voices shaping Africa's future, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who challenge old assumptions and inspire a new generation, subscribe and be part of the few who choose truth over headlines. The next chapter of West Africa is being written now, and your voice still matters in how the story unfolds.